Evening all, and that was my Andrew Marr impression that I did to start the video, and more of him later on this episode. Two things stood out for me this week. Now, there's a number of ancillary issues I could talk about, but I really want to focus on two things in particular. And the first one being the London Bridge attack, because I think that's thrown up a lot of things politically that I think need looking into. Now, on social media, I avoided generally talking about the incident. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I saw the video very shortly after the incident took place, and a lot of people were speculating, and they continued to speculate. And I didn't want to jump in because I've done this in the past. As a noob on social media, you see a news story developing, you have a rush to judgment, and then the facts come out, and you have to do a lot of backtracking afterwards. So what stood out for me was the changing narrative. Now, we've all seen the video footage, and a lot of stuff emerged. And in classic fashion, not so much the media, who I was surprised didn't jump to conclusions right away. But what happened was the Twitterati, the commentariat, as it were all very quick to judge. So we had the incident, as it was shown. It was quite full-on and graphic. Somebody took a footage from the bus. They quickly panned away just as the police shots were being fired. Now, a lot of people on the left, and the cat's on the prowl again. That's just to warn you. She might make an appearance across the screen. So what happened was that a lot of the left-wing commentariat were very quick to jump on the false flag narrative, that this happened at a time of an election. It has to be Boris, it has to be the Conservatives doing this as a false flag operation. FYI, Great Britain generally doesn't do false flag operations. And in fact, if you have a look at the history of false flag operations, since World War II, there have really only been two perpetrated by Western democracies. I know there's the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's the most famous one, but it generally doesn't happen unless you have a mindset of a conspiracy theorist, which I don't. So a lot of people saying that it was a Conservative Party false flag operation. And then they said it was a Conservative Party. It was Boris Johnson, the government, and the Israeli government working together here. Where the proof of that is anyone's guess. But, in a week where Labour are trying to play down fears of anti-Semitism, there are a lot of Labour activists sort of saying there's an Israeli-British government plot to carry out a false flag attack. Just goes to show you how deep the mindset is within the Labour ranks. But then there are others, the kind of the pacifist side of it, which is often embodied with Jeremy Corbyn. I deploy violence from all sides. I know that sounds a bit more like Ken Clark doing an impression of Jeremy Corbyn. But the thing is that people say, well, why couldn't they have arrested the attacker rather than just shoot him? Because you see in the video footage, three members of what we thought at the time were the public, a little bit more on that later, but they pounce on this guy, then the police drag them off, and then they shoot the guy on the ground because he's wearing what they think to be a suicide vest. It's a mock-up of a suicide vest, but the police weren't to know that at the time, so they shot him as a matter of course. Now, a lot of people who don't understand how police and sometimes special forces operations work think they just could have arrested him. Well, the thing about a suicide vest is that they're often work off a hair trigger. They work that it can be triggered in a split second, and police and special forces are trained not to take that risk. If you shoot the guy before they have a chance to activate the vest. Now, I have some experience of this. Don't worry, I've never been in the special forces or the police, but I was a cadet and I did some cadet instructing, and I've done, for my sins, I've done reenactment as well. And And I learnt a lot of the army doctrine of the time. It's going back to the 1990s. And what it was, we would do these scenarios, when we're doing these field training weekends, and learning the kind of army drill and army procedures. So what would happen is that we would have we'd be in a firefight. It's all blank ammunition and stuff, but we're learning tactics, and we would have this firefight, and then the enemy force, so the cadet instructors being the aggressor force, would then run away, but one of them would be left behind, usually the fattest cadet instructor. And when we would advance to secure the area, this cadet instructor would always lie face down in the ground with one arm sort of out of view, sort of under his torso. And they always played this trick, they always wanted to get one over the cadets and the noob instructors, right? So you got this guy lying face down with one arm underneath him. And of course, that's where he's got the explosive device. So there are a couple of procedures that you can do if you suspect that there is a wounded enemy, or there's somebody you think is playing dead in this scenario. There's a very complicated maneuver where one person gets behind the body, another person's pointing a rifle, standing a few feet away, pointing the rifle, and then you're supposed to, on three, roll the body over slightly to see if there's an explosive device. If there is, you shoot the guy. You're supposed to roll the body down, and I think it's been a long time. It's over 20 years since I did this. Then the person who's rolled the body back, they're to put themselves on top of the enemy, because the enemy will take the force of the blast. Anyway, that's the complicated version, and it can go wrong if you're not coordinated enough. And the instructor would always, like, the moment you started shifting your back, would go bang, and just, and you're dead, and you're dead, and you're dead, and you didn't follow the manual, and you didn't follow the training, and they would gloat over us, and they would mention it throughout the rest of the weekend. You got caught out in that noob trick. Yeah, cadet instructors. But anyway, the other thing is that you don't take the risk and you just shoot the guy because he's a potential threat. That's the simplest way of doing it. So, you secure the aircraft. That rambling anecdote just means that, no, the procedure isn't to take a risk. You don't take risks with human lives. Remember, there's civilian lives. This is a police operation. This isn't a military operation. So there are civilians all around. That guy's suicide vest was real. It could not only kill the police officers there, it would take out the have-a-go heroes at anybody in that vicinity, depending on how much explosive was in the vest anyway. So that's why they couldn't do that. They couldn't just arrest him and ask him to come quietly and ask him to slowly remove the vest and defuse it. But then other narratives started to appear. And one of them, everybody wanted to know who the guy in the suit, the dark suit, was, because he was holding a knife twixt finger and thumb. And they said, what a hero, what a hero. This guy just picks up the knife and he just walks away to a safe distance and he's calm as you like. Well, it turned out he was a plainclothes policeman, so that wasn't quite the hero everybody was looking for. The armed response team weren't the heroes people were looking for. Well, there's another side why it wasn't a false flag. So how did the police get there so quickly? Well, you have in that part of London armed response vehicles patrolling around the area. Time delay between when something goes wrong, when the attacker broke out of this meeting. He was at this kind of, I think it was criminal rehabilitation talk he was attending. By the time he broke out and got to London Bridge and had stabbed two people along the way, the armed response vehicle, they're in that city of London area, they would have got there very quickly. So it all matches up. It's not like they have to go right across London to get there. They're already in the area because it's a high level risk target in the city of London. So anyway, back to the original point in the search for a heroic narrative. So the plainclothes policeman clearly wasn't the hero that people were looking at. So then the story about the guy with the narwhal tusk. So, and chap hears this is going on. The closest thing that looks like a weapon he has to hand is this 5-foot-long narwhal tusk, which it takes out of its frame on the wall and goes and takes on the attacker. Now, He seemed a very good candidate, depending on where you are politically. That not only did he improvise with a narwhal tusk, so there's a kind of coolness factor to it, as people thought, but he was a Polish immigrant. Yes, a Polish immigrant. If we didn't have that immigrant, we'd all be dead. Oh, the Poles, they came to our rescue in the war, and now we just want to send them back because there's too many and we're isolationist and we dream of the empire, and it was slotting into that narrative. However, the problem is that the fact that he was Polish is neither here nor there. This is a situation where, let's say, there were no Polish people, no immigrants in the area. But highly likely other people would have stepped up. There's the chap with the fire extinguisher that everybody seems to have forgotten about. There were other people around. I'm not saying that somebody in the exact same position would grab the narwhal tusk. But the thing is that heroism isn't confined to certain nationalities. When you're in situations like that, people will respond in different ways. It's not like this narrative about, it's an immigrant saved the day, kind of implies that all Poles are heroic and all British people are cowardly, and it wouldn't work like that. And it's just wrong to politicize the guy's nationality and migrant status just to make a point. I mean, one of the things is that if, let's say, we had tighter immigration rules, okay, and a points-based immigration system, what's to say that this guy wouldn't have made the threshold and made it in anyway? It's to me, it's a moot point. But this is the whole thing about the London attack, is that it's people are already trying to manipulate it to pursue narratives. In particular, the Labour Party and Labour activists who took a very bizarre look at this incident and stole a lot of traditional Conservative talking points here. Why was he let out early? How many people have been let out? How many risks to society have been let out early and they're prowling our streets and they could attack at any moment? How many terrorists are out there? Seems very odd that Labour under Jeremy Corbyn is taking this line, considering they traditionally for decades have been pushing for softer sentences not that long ago, and they're still doing it. They still want Shamia Burgum to come back, to have a chat, to have a cosy chat. She shouldn't lose her citizenship. She should be invited back to have a chat about what made her run off and become an ISIS bride in the first place. So the whole thing that Labour have always been saying you can't have stop and search, that's racist. But now, oh no, it's all different now, and it's the hypocrisy of it that reeks. That suddenly, when it's convenient for them, when it's convenient for Sadiq Khan to start aping traditional Conservative talking points about law, order, and what should we do with terrorists. And what I found particularly rich from Sadiq Khan was he was saying, this is a result of police cuts. Well, the police were there very quickly. There was an armed police unit there as soon as possible. That was minutes. What do you mean police cuts? They were there. They were present. They solved it. And the other thing is that some anti-gun activists have been saying, you don't need a gun. You just need an narwhal tusk. Who needs a firearm? Not forgetting that this situation was resolved with firearms. So that's what really got to me about this whole incident. There are very serious questions to be asked about the status of terrorists and criminals being released, too early, soft sentencing, soft judges. And I think it needs looking into a lot more, rather than everybody just trying to use this incident to push their own narratives. The other thing I particularly wanted to talk about this week was the interviews with political leaders. Now, we had successive interviews where Andrew Neil questioned Jeremy Corbyn and Joe Swinson, gave them a really tough grilling, and neither leader came out looking good. Although Aaron Bastani, he of Navarro Media, claimed that it was a victory for Corbyn. He was about the only one who felt that way. It was very weird, but then, he does change things to suit his agenda. Facts have never got in the way of Aaron Bastani. The fact that he still, and Ash Sarkar still get onto our TV screens with frightening regularity is an ongoing concern, but enough of them. So, when it came time to Boris Johnson, but the Boris Johnson team, Team Johnson, delayed, prevaricated, put off an interview with Andrew Neil. They had conditions, they had demands, and those conditions had to be met before Johnson would consider being interviewed by Andrew Neil. Now, the thing is, a lot of people saw that as a sign of cowardice, and a lot of people on his own side, people on the right, wanted him to go head-to-head with Andrew Neil. Now, Andrew Neil is a very tough interviewer, make no mistake. That's what his reputation is. He can find the weak spots in most people's arguments and go after them. He asks questions that a lot of politicians can't answer. And this makes for very good, very dramatic television. He's not infallible, though, Andrew Neil. His interview with Ben Shapiro was particularly bad. It was bad for both of them. Neither of them had prepared properly for the interview. Neither of them exactly knew who each other was. And it looked like Andrew Neil had been given a set of questions from researchers and his producer that it didn't, put it this way, the questions Andrew Neil were asking didn't seem organic to him. They seemed like they were given to him to put to Ben Shapiro, and his whole line of questioning relied on Twitter archaeology. And Shapiro hadn't prepared as his defense, and he thought Andrew Neil was possibly Andrew Marr. And they both came away looking like fools, in my opinion. So he's not infallible. And the other time I saw Andrew Neil being fallible was courtesy of yours truly, where he made an erroneous point on the Daily Politics, and I called into the BBC to register a complaint, and Andrew Neil got a little bit uppity. I don't make mistakes, Mr. Hughes. He did. It was about World War II. Shall I use? I'll tell you this anecdote because that's what I do. Right. So, a few years ago, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, he was talking about Britain's role in World War II at some speech or other, and he said that Britain always had a subservient role in World War II. And Andrew Neil said, that only counted after 1941 when the Americans joined. Not so clever now, are you, Mr. Cameron? So I complain. Actually, we were, before the Americans joined in World War II, we had been subservient. We were under French command for the first year and a bit. Until France got knocked out of the war, we were under French command. It was French strategy that we followed, French land warfare doctrine that we followed. We took France's lead in World War II, as we had done in World War One. This was to be fought primarily on French soil, so they got to call the shots. And Andrew Neil conveniently forgot that. When I pointed that out to him, he and his production team did not like it one bit. I got a bit of a frosty response on that week's Point of View. Oh no, it's Talk But Bite Back. It's the one on Radio 4, anyway, the complaint show. So, anyway. That's just an aside. But the point is, Andrew Neil is not infallible as an interviewer. And I personally think Boris Johnson should go for it. But I do understand if he just wants to make Andrew Neil wait. And what's interesting is that not being able to get on Andrew Neil, Boris Johnson agreed to go on Andrew Marr. And this has just happened recently. And what happened was that Marr just had a disaster. Lots of people are talking about this. Lots of people are tweeting about this. And the problem is that Marr constantly interrupted Johnson. The Prime Minister just could not get a single sentence out without being interrupted. And yes, you could say that Johnson was taking a very roundabout way to make a point, and there was fun with arms and ohs and yeah, well, you see, and it's quite like this, and his points were being couched in a lot of extra terminology. Now, as an expert waffler myself, I understand where Johnson's coming from. Not everybody is so polished and succinct as, say, Tony Blair, armed with a fistful of sound bites. But that's part of Boris's charm. Everybody knows that he meanders a bit when he talks, and he ums and ahs. That's just part of it. And Marr should just, less is more. He's got the questions. Just ask the questions and let the Prime Minister get there in a reasonable amount of time before trying to steer him back on course. If the substance is veering off course, then you steer him back. Now, I complained about Andrew Neil in the past being terrible at interruptions, and he was on the Daily Politics when he was doing daytime TV. He was terrible at interruptions. I think I timed one of his interruptions with David Willits. Willits was 2 seconds into a response before Neil interrupted him. And it was just pointless. I think it looked like it was merely designed to put people like David Willits off, or other interviewees, just put them off rather than to demand that they get to the point. But since he shifted to the evening, over time, Neil has refined this, and so his interruptions seem more on point. He does seem to interrupt only when the politician is really veering off course, and when the politician has been given enough time to speak. Or it doesn't have to be a politician, it could be anybody's interviewing, but they have to have said something, they have to be given a reasonable amount of time, and they must have deviated significantly before he interrupts and brings them back. Not so with Marr. Bang, interruption, and it was terrible. And if the Johnson team want to use that as a kind of warm-up, okay, Boris, you've seen off Marr, maybe it's time that we will do Andrew Neil, and it will be kind of like the main event. It's the one that everybody's looking forward to. I don't mind a few days in between interviews because it serves to distance the Prime Minister from his competitors. He's not just yet another one. He's that little bit special. He's that one you have to wait for a little bit more. I can see the tactics there, if that is indeed the tactics that they're going for. And I wouldn't interfere with that. If you want to start messing with the BBC's head, and I think if any organisation needs messing with and playing mind games with, it's the BBC. So I'm hoping that these are just delaying tactics and getting Boris warmed up on Andrew Marr first before tackling Andrew Neil. But I think it won't seem the same if he avoids Neil altogether. I think it has to happen. I think it will cheapen the Conservative campaign if he doesn't go up against Andrew Neil at some point. So I'm going to round off this week. I'm not going into the minutiae of every kind of interesting story that's happened this week, because I want to talk about the bigger things that are going on, the kind of things that are kind of underpinning the events this week and the general election that we find ourselves in. And the third one is the slight bounce back of Labour in the wake of their free spending, renationalise everything plans. And it seems there are worrying things here, that so many people have been taken in by this. And I think generally the people who are backing Labour fall into two camps. Well, actually, I should say three camps. So the easiest one is that kind of student level mentality, the kind of student activist mentality that's underpinned Corbyn ever since he announced his Labour leadership campaign. A largely ignorant, aggressive, kind of nasty, mendacious crowd that will back him hell or high water. They're really in it to put the boot in to anybody who's not a socialist, basically. It's a very angry, vindictive mob. And that kind of underpins the Corbyn base. The second group are the kind of dyed-in-the-wool, kind of working class. I've never voted Tory before, and my father and my grandfather never voted them, and I will not sully their memory and change the habits of a lifetime. And there's a very ingrained... they're not impressed with Corbyn. They're not impressed with his stance on Brexit, and they're not impressed by the fact that he seemingly is dominated by a cabal of student activists and those with the student mentality. So they're not impressed, but dogs always return to their vomit, as the Bible says. And the third one, and this is the worrying and the most perplexing one, is the urban bourgeois. This week we had a tweet by Richard Osman saying, yes. There's a Richard Osman, the guy off Pointless, TV producer and TV presenter, and he said, oh yes, I know the anti-Semitism stuff, but on the other hand, and he was praising the Labour's economic free spending. Now, and Hugh Grant was doing it as well, and a few other of these bourgeois metropolitan types. And you think, well, what's in it for you? Because if a Corbyn government comes to power, they're going to be the ones that are taxed at these high levels. And they're the ones, a lot of them working in the media, or if they're in London, with its Jewish population, they'll be living out in the nice leafy burbs with Jewish neighbours. I mean, how can they look their neighbours in the face? We have 85 to 87% of Jews polled in this country worried about a Corbyn government and what that will mean to the safety of Jews in the United Kingdom. So how can these bourgeois types, knowing so many Jews, even Jews like Michael Rosen, who it just baffles me. Why does he think that a Corbyn government that will do him no favours that is somehow better? And the only thing I can think of is this whole good versus evil thing that goes on in the heads of Labour. I mean, I had this at the start of the week, being accused of being the baddies. I'm on the side of the baddies, which was interesting because at the time I didn't. I was tweeting something and I didn't declare my political affiliations. I just criticised Labour about one specific issue. But I'm on the side of the baddies for doing that. And that's how they see it. Good, evil, baddies, goodies. And Labour may be anti-Semitic, and their spending plans make no sense, and it could bankrupt the country. But hey, they're still the goodies, and you back the goodies. This is a weird mentality. And I think you cannot win economic arguments without winning a culture war argument. And I just look at this and I go, okay, I can think of tactics to win the disillusioned working class voters of this country. And I can think of tactics that will appeal to normies. But how to break the mentality of the bourgeois champagne socialists, how to break the spell with them, I have no idea. I don't know why they still cling to these delusions about Labour being the good guys. When we've seen, at the start of the week, we saw literally a communist defending the practice of going out and intimidating, abusing, and vandalizing conservatives and local conservative branch officers. And then the next day she said, oh, I'm getting all this abuse. It's terrible. I'm being abused by the right. She wants it both ways. It's okay for her and her cronies to intimidate and threaten and harass conservatives, but it's not all right for conservatives to even say something nasty to her. So how do we break the power of the socialists over the metropolitan bourgeois? That's the cultural war battle we are going to have to fight. Okay, we're fighting. It'd be like trying to break people out of a cult. With the normies, you just have to keep reminding them that the evils of socialism and the sinister side of Corbyn-led Labour, and you can win that one. But the cult that the bourgeois metropolitan types are in You have to start thinking about it like that. If we're going to develop tactics, we have to start thinking they're in a cult and they need to be snapped out of the cult. So, work in progress there, guys, and get onto it. Now, I am pleased to announce the greedy so-and-so's in my house didn't eat all the biscuits this week. So I'm going to say, keep the faith, right? Keep the socialists out by whatever means you can, legal means you can. And if you think that Jeremy Corbyn did well against Andrew Neil, well, you're really taking the biscuit. Oh,